Kursk Oblast, Soviet Union, November 1948. The winter descends on the Russian countryside with biblical severity. Snow falls in sheets that turn the landscape white and featureless. Temperatures plummet to -30°C. In villages across the Soviet Union, families huddle around wood stoves, burning precious fuel to keep from freezing, watching their supplies dwindle as the long winter stretches ahead. But in the small farming collective of Krasnaya Polyana, 40 kilometers south of Kursk, something remarkable is happening. One farmhouse stands different from the others. Smoke rises from its chimney, yes, but less than from neighboring homes. The windows glow warm at night. The family inside moves about in shirt-sleeves, while outside the world freezes. And most remarkably, they're burning almost no fuel at all. The man responsible is Ivan Petrovich Sokolov, a 42-year-old collective farm worker with a 6th grade education and hands calloused from decades of agricultural labor. He isn't a scientist or an engineer. He's a farmer who spent his evenings tinkering in a workshop attached to his modest home, experimenting with ideas that came to him while working in the fields, building things from scrap metal and salvaged materials. What Ivan Sokolov invented in the autumn of 1948 was a heating system that seemed to violate the laws of thermodynamics, a device that produced far more heat than the fuel it consumed should have been able to generate, something that locals began calling Sokolov's miracle stove, though Ivan himself insisted it was simply efficient design and proper understanding of heat circulation. Word spread quickly through the collective farm. Neighbors visited and saw the impossible with their own eyes. Ivan's family was warm while burning perhaps 1/5 the firewood that other families required. The house maintained comfortable temperatures even when the stove was barely stoked. Something was happening that conventional understanding couldn't explain. District party officials came to investigate. At first skeptical, then amazed. They watched the system operate. They measured fuel consumption. They checked for hidden heat sources or deception. They found none. Ivan Sokolov had apparently discovered something genuinely revolutionary, a way to heat homes that could save millions of tons of fuel across the Soviet Union, that could ease the burden on families struggling through brutal winters, that could solve one of the perennial problems of life in northern climates. A report was filed with regional authorities. Engineers from Kursk were dispatched to examine the system. On December 3, 1948, Ivan Sokolov gave a demonstration to a delegation from Moscow, explaining his principles, showing how the system worked, offering to share his innovation freely for the benefit of the Soviet people. The officials were impressed. They promised that Ivan's invention would be studied, that if it proved viable at scale, it would be implemented across the country, that he would be recognized as a hero of socialist labor for his contribution to Soviet progress. And then, on December 10, 1948, 1 week after the Moscow delegation's visit, Ivan Petrovich Sokolov vanished. No arrest, no public announcement, no trial or confession. He simply disappeared from Krasnaya Polyana, along with all documentation of his invention, all the notebooks where he'd sketched his ideas, all physical evidence that the miracle stove had ever existed. His wife was told he'd been transferred to a research facility in Moscow to continue his work, but no address was provided. No letters came, no further information was ever released. Inquiries were met with silence or vague assurances that he was serving the state and could not be contacted. For 76 years, the fate of Ivan Sokolov and his revolutionary heating system remained a mystery, a footnote in local history. A story old-timers in Kursk Oblast told about the farmer who'd invented something miraculous and then disappeared. Most assumed he'd been taken to some secret research facility, his invention classified, his work absorbed into the vast machinery of Soviet scientific development. But the truth, when it finally emerged in 2024, would prove far stranger and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Because Ivan Sokolov hadn't been taken to Moscow, and his invention hadn't been classified for the good of the state. What happened to the farmer who'd discovered free heating was something that revealed uncomfortable truths about innovation, power, and the way systems protect themselves from change. November 1948. The invention. Ivan Sokolov had been working on his heating system for 3 years, since the brutal winter of 1945-46, when his youngest daughter nearly died from pneumonia in their inadequately heated home. That experience had driven him to obsession. There had to be a better way. Fuel was scarce and expensive. Traditional stoves were inefficient, losing most of their heat through chimneys. Families froze while burning through their winter supplies in weeks rather than months. Ivan wasn't educated in thermodynamics or engineering, but he understood practical mechanics from years of repairing farm equipment. He understood airflow from building grain silos. He understood heat retention from watching bread ovens. And he had an intuitive sense of how systems could be improved through observation and experimentation. His workshop was filled with salvaged materials, scrap metal from broken farm machinery, pipes from abandoned irrigation systems, bricks from demolished buildings. Everything that might be useful was collected, sorted, studied. Ivan worked by lamplight after long days in the fields, sketching designs in notebooks, building prototypes, testing and refining. The breakthrough came in the autumn of 1948. According to witnesses who saw the system before it disappeared, Ivan had created something that worked on principles of heat, recirculation, and thermal mass storage. The exact mechanics were never fully documented before the system was dismantled, but eyewitnesses described several key features. First, an elaborate heat exchanger system that captured heat normally lost through the chimney. Hot exhaust gases were routed through a maze of metal pipes embedded in clay and brick, transferring their thermal energy before being vented outside. What would normally escape as waste heat was instead captured and radiated into the living space. Second, a thermal mass storage system using special clay bricks that Ivan had formulated himself. These bricks absorbed heat during firing and released it slowly over many hours. The exact composition was Ivan's secret, something involving local clay mixed with materials he collected from the fields, possibly including certain minerals or metallic compounds that enhanced heat retention. Third, a circulation system that didn't require electricity. Through careful design of air channels and the strategic placement of vents, Ivan created natural convection currents that distributed heat throughout the house without pumps or fans. Warm air rose, circulated through channels in the walls and ceiling, and descended on the far side of the house, creating constant flow. The result was remarkable. Neighbors testified that Ivan's house maintained temperatures of 20 to 22 degrees Celsius, while burning approximately 1/5 the firewood they required for similar warmth. The thermal mass stored enough heat that the fire could be allowed to die overnight, yet the house remained comfortable until morning. On particularly cold days, a single small fire in the morning was sufficient to keep the house warm for 24 hours. When district officials first investigated, they were skeptical. They looked for hidden fuel sources, for tricks or deception. They found none. They brought engineers who measured fuel consumption meticulously. The numbers were undeniable. Ivan Sokolov's system was producing results that seemed impossible by conventional understanding. One engineer, whose report was later found in declassified archives, wrote, "The efficiency of Sokolov's heating system exceeds anything I have encountered in 20 years of industrial engineering. Either our understanding of thermodynamics is incomplete, or Comrade Sokolov has discovered principles of heat management that have eluded trained scientists. Further investigation is urgently required." That investigation came in the form of the Moscow delegation in early December. 3 officials from the Ministry of Heavy Industry, accompanied by 2 scientists from the Academy of Sciences. They spent 2 days in Krasnaya Polyana, examining the system, questioning Ivan, taking measurements. According to Ivan's wife, interviewed decades later, the officials were both impressed and disturbed. Impressed by the results, disturbed by the implications. If this system worked as demonstrated, it would revolutionize heating across the Soviet Union. It would reduce fuel consumption dramatically. It would improve quality of life for millions of citizens. But it would also disrupt established industries, coal mining, forestry, the entire infrastructure built around fuel production and distribution, jobs, bureaucracies, power structures that depended on scarcity and control of essential resources. One official, according to Ivan's wife, said something that stayed with her forever. "This is remarkable, Comrade Sokolov. Truly remarkable. But you must understand, the state has many considerations. Technical merit is only one factor. There are larger concerns: economic stability, employment, the careful balance of industrial planning." Ivan, naive in the ways of Soviet bureaucracy, had responded enthusiastically. "But Comrade Official, think of the benefits. Millions of families warm in winter. Fuel saved for industry. This could help build socialism." The official had smiled thinly. Indeed, we will study this carefully. You have done a great service to the state. 1 week later, Ivan disappeared. December 10th, 1948. The vanishing. The details of Ivan Sokolov's disappearance were reconstructed decades later from witness testimonies and fragmentary archival documents. The story that emerges is chilling in its bureaucratic efficiency. Early morning, December 10th, 1948. A black car arrived in Krasnaya Polyana just after dawn. 3 men in leather coats, the uniform of NKVD officers. Though by 1948 the organization had been renamed MGB, Ministry of State Security, they went directly to Ivan's home. His wife, Ekaterina, answered the door. The men were polite but firm. Ivan Petrovich Sokolov was required in Moscow for consultations regarding his heating system. This was a great honor. The state recognized his contribution and wished to develop his invention for the benefit of the Soviet people. He should pack a small bag. He would return in a few weeks once the consultations were complete. Ivan, according to Ekaterina's testimony, was excited. He saw this as validation, as the beginning of something wonderful. His invention would be shared across the country. Families would benefit. He would be recognized. He kissed his wife and children goodbye, promising to write as soon as he reached Moscow, assuring them he would return soon. He left with the 3 men. The car drove away toward Kursk. That was the last time anyone in Krasnaya Polyana saw Ivan Petrovich Sokolov. Later that same day, more officials arrived. Engineers this time, with tools and equipment. They informed Ekaterina that they needed to document Ivan's heating system for replication. She let them in, believing this was part of the official process. They worked for 2 days, but they weren't documenting the system. They were dismantling it. Every component was removed. The heat exchanger, the special bricks, the circulation channels. Everything that made Ivan's invention unique was systematically taken apart and removed. When Ekaterina protested, she was told this was necessary for proper study in Moscow laboratories. The components would be analyzed, improved, mass-produced. Better versions would be returned for installation. She should be proud of her husband's contribution to Soviet science, but nothing was ever returned. The house was left with a standard wood stove, inefficient and ordinary, and Ivan's workshop was emptied completely. His notebooks, his sketches, his tools, his experimental materials, everything was loaded into trucks and driven away. Neighbors who had witnessed the miracle stove were visited by officials and advised not to discuss it. The system was now a state secret, under development for the benefit of all Soviet citizens. Premature disclosure could help enemies of the state. Silence was patriotic. Over the following weeks, Ekaterina wrote letters to every ministry she could think of, trying to find her husband. She received form responses assuring her that Ivan was safe and engaged in important work for the state. No details could be provided for security reasons. She should be patient. Months passed. No letters from Ivan. No information about his whereabouts. No indication he would return. Ekaterina's inquiries became more desperate, then eventually ceased altogether. She understood, as people learned to understand in Stalin's Soviet Union, that asking too many questions was dangerous. Years passed. Decades. The Soviet Union collapsed. Archives opened. Ekaterina, now an old woman, submitted formal requests for information about her husband's fate. She received partial responses, heavily redacted documents, fragments of truth mixed with bureaucratic evasion. What she learned was this: Ivan had never reached Moscow. The car that took him from Krasnaya Polyana had driven not to the capital but to a facility outside Kursk. The facility was designated only by a number in official documents. Its purpose was classified. Ivan had been held there for an unknown period. There were records of his presence, sign-in logs with his name, but no details about what happened during his confinement. Then the records simply stopped. No release order, no transfer, no death certificate. He had entered the facility and then vanished from all official documentation. Ekaterina died in 2003, never knowing what happened to her husband, never understanding why he had been taken or where he had gone. But she never stopped believing that his invention had been real, that he had discovered something important, that he had been punished for succeeding rather than rewarded. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved. Ivan Sokolov had become another victim of Soviet repression, another name on the long list of those who disappeared into the machinery of state security. His fate, like his invention, was lost to history. Until 2024, when construction workers demolishing an abandoned Soviet-era facility outside Kursk discovered something that had been hidden for 76 years, something that would finally answer what happened to the farmer who invented free heating. June 2024. The discovery. The facility was scheduled for demolition, building number 7, in what had been a classified research complex during the Soviet era. Abandoned since the 1990s, slowly decaying, finally slated for removal to make way for commercial development. The buildings were empty, stripped of anything valuable, forgotten monuments to a collapsed system. The demolition crew began with the outer structures, working their way toward the main building. When they breached the basement level, they found something unexpected, a sealed section that didn't appear on any blueprints, a room that had been deliberately concealed, walled off behind brick and concrete, hidden so completely that it had remained undiscovered for decades. The crew chief, thinking this might be hazardous materials or unexploded ordnance, called authorities before proceeding. Engineers and safety inspectors arrived. They carefully opened the sealed section, not knowing what they would find. What they discovered was a workshop, or more precisely, the remains of a workshop. Workbenches, tools, equipment, and most significantly, components of a heating system unlike anything in standard Soviet designs. Metal pipes arranged in intricate patterns, special bricks of unusual composition, notebooks filled with technical drawings and calculations, and in a corner of the room, partially concealed behind equipment, human remains, a skeleton clothed in decayed fabric that had once been farmers' work clothes. Near the body, an identification booklet, its pages brittle but legible. The name inside, Ivan Petrovich Sokolov, resident of Krasnaya Polyana, Kursk Oblast. Date of birth, March 15, 1906. After 76 years, the farmer who vanished had been found. But he hadn't disappeared into the Gulag archipelago or been executed and buried in an unmarked grave. He'd been brought to this facility, locked in this sealed room with components of his own invention, and left to die. The investigation that followed, conducted by Russian prosecutors and historical researchers, pieced together what had happened based on the physical evidence and newly declassified documents. Ivan Sokolov had been brought to this facility in December 1948, not for consultation but for elimination. His heating system had been deemed too disruptive to be allowed. But simply killing him and suppressing the invention wasn't enough. The state needed to understand how it worked, to ensure that the principles couldn't be independently rediscovered, to analyze and potentially classify the technology. So Ivan had been imprisoned in this workshop with components of his system and ordered to document everything, how it worked, the exact specifications, the materials, the principles, everything that would allow the state to fully understand and control the technology. Based on notebooks found in the room, Ivan had complied, at least initially. Perhaps he believed cooperation would earn his release. Perhaps he thought full documentation would lead to implementation of his system. Perhaps he had no choice, but as weeks became months, as the isolation continued, the notebook entries changed tone, from technical documentation to desperate pleas, from cooperation to defiance, from hope to despair. One entry, dated March 1949, 3 months after his arrival. They have no intention of using this. I understand now. I was a fool. This isn't about helping the Soviet people. This is about control, about suppressing anything that disrupts established systems. My invention works too well. It makes people too independent. It reduces demand for state-controlled fuel. This cannot be allowed in a system built on dependency and scarcity. Another from May 1949. I have stopped cooperating. Let them figure it out themselves. I will not help them bury what could have helped millions. If I must die here, let me die knowing I didn't betray my own creation. They can have the physical components, but not the full understanding. Some secrets I will take to my grave. The final entries, dated July 1949, showed a man facing death with a combination of defiance and resignation. Food deliveries have stopped. This is how they solved the problem. Starvation. Quiet. Deniable. I will die here in this room surrounded by my invention. The irony is bitter. I created something to keep families warm. Now I freeze and starve alone because it worked too well. To whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, my name is Ivan Petrovich Sokolov. I was a farmer from Krasnaya Polyana. I invented a heating system that could have helped millions. I was disappeared because my success threatened established interests. This is the truth they tried to bury. Remember me. Remember what was lost." The notebook ended there. Forensic analysis of the remains suggested Ivan had died sometime in mid to late 1949, approximately 6 to 8 months after being brought to the facility. Cause of death: starvation and exposure. He had frozen to death in a room containing his own heating invention, which couldn't function without fuel that was deliberately withheld. The cruelty was almost poetic. The man who had invented a revolutionary heating system had died of cold, surrounded by the very technology that could have saved him, killed by the system he'd tried to serve. Asterisk, asterisk, the technology. Lost and found. Asterisk, asterisk, among the most significant discoveries in the sealed workshop were Ivan's notebooks and the partially intact components of his heating system. For the first time in 76 years, engineers could analyze what he had actually created. Modern thermal engineers examining the materials were astonished. Ivan Sokolov, working with salvaged materials and no formal training, had independently discovered or anticipated several principles that wouldn't become widespread in heating technology until decades later. The heat exchanger design showed sophisticated understanding of counterflow heat transfer. The thermal mass storage system used clay bricks with embedded metallic compounds that significantly enhanced heat retention properties. The natural convection circulation system demonstrated intuitive grasp of fluid dynamics. Most remarkably, Ivan had discovered what modern engineers call thermal lag optimization, using the delay between heat input and heat release to create sustained warmth from minimal fuel consumption. His special bricks absorbed heat rapidly during firing, but released it slowly over many hours, creating a thermal battery effect. Dr. Mikhail Petrov, a thermal engineering professor from Moscow State University, who examined the system, said in an interview, "What Sokolov created with farm scrap and intuition, we now build with advanced materials and computer modeling." His efficiency calculations were remarkably accurate. If his system had been implemented in 1948, it would have been 30 years ahead of comparable Western technology. The fuel savings across the Soviet Union would have been enormous. The economic and social impact would have been transformative. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was evidence that Soviet authorities had fully understood the potential. Documents found in archives showed that engineers who examined Ivan's system in December 1948 had written enthusiastic reports about its revolutionary nature, recommending immediate large-scale testing and implementation, whose recommendations had been overruled at higher levels. A memo from a deputy minister in the Ministry of Heavy Industry, dated December 8, 1948, laid out the reasoning with chilling bureaucratic clarity. While Comrade Sokolov's heating system demonstrates remarkable efficiency, implementation would create unacceptable disruptions to established industrial production. Coal mining employs 800,000 workers. Forestry for fuel would employ 400,000. Distribution and transportation of heating fuel employs additional hundreds of thousands. Reducing fuel consumption by even 50% would necessitate massive workforce reallocation and industrial reorganization. Furthermore, reduced fuel dependency would diminish state control over an essential resource. Citizens who can heat their homes independently are less dependent on state distribution systems. This creates potential for decreased social cohesion and increased individualism. Recommendation: the technology should be classified and suppressed. Comrade Sokolov should be detained to prevent independent dissemination. The heating system should be studied to ensure no similar innovations emerge, but not implemented. The maintenance of current industrial structures takes precedence over theoretical efficiency gains. The document was signed by 3 ministry officials. It bore approval stamps from higher authorities. The decision to destroy Ivan Sokolov and his invention hadn't been an accident or the action of rogue agents. It had been deliberate state policy, made at high levels, justified by economic and political calculations that valued system stability over innovation and human welfare. Ivan Sokolov had been sacrificed not because his invention didn't work, but precisely because it worked too well. He had threatened established interests. He had created something that would have empowered ordinary citizens at the expense of state control. And for that, he had to disappear. Asterisk, asterisk, the aftermath. Reckoning with history, The discovery of Ivan Sokolov's remains and the documentation of his suppressed invention created a sensation in Russia and internationally. It became a symbol of Soviet-era repression of innovation, of how bureaucratic interests could override human welfare, of the cost of prioritizing system maintenance over progress. Russian prosecutors opened an investigation, though all those directly responsible were long dead. The investigation was more about historical truth than criminal prosecution. What had happened? Who had made the decisions? How had such a crime been committed and concealed for so long? DNA testing confirmed the remains were Ivan's, comparing samples with his living descendants. His great-granddaughter, Elena Sokolova, had never known her great-grandfather existed until contacted by investigators. She had grown up knowing only that there was some family tragedy in the past, something her grandmother never discussed. Elena said in an interview, "Learning about Ivan has been overwhelming. To discover I had a great-grandfather who was a genius, an inventor who created something revolutionary, and that he was murdered by the state for succeeding. It changes how you see history. These aren't just abstract tragedies. These are real people, real families destroyed, real innovations lost. My great-grandmother died never knowing what happened to her husband. That pain rippled through generations. Ivan's remains were given a proper burial in Krasnaya Polyana, the village he'd lived in and loved. Hundreds attended, including government officials, engineers, and citizens who saw him as a symbol of Soviet-era injustice. A monument was erected showing Ivan with his invention, accompanied by a plaque that read, Ivan Petrovich Sokolov, 1906 to 1949. Farmer, inventor, murdered for the crime of innovation. His gift to humanity was stolen. His life was taken. His memory endures. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was practical rather than symbolic. Using Ivan's notebooks and the recovered components, modern engineers reconstructed his heating system. Working prototypes were built and tested in controlled conditions. The results vindicated everything witnesses had claimed in 1948. The system worked exactly as described, achieving remarkable efficiency through elegant design and innovative materials. Modern versions, built with contemporary materials but following Ivan's principles, showed even better performance. Several Russian companies began manufacturing heating systems based on Ivan's designs, marketed as the Sokolov system. They've been installed in thousands of homes across Russia, particularly in rural areas where fuel efficiency is crucial. Each installation includes a small plaque explaining the system's history, ensuring that Ivan's story isn't forgotten. In 2025, Ivan Sokolov was posthumously awarded the Order of Merit, one of Russia's highest civilian honors. The citation read, "For revolutionary contribution to thermal engineering and posthumous service to the welfare of Russian citizens." His invention, suppressed in his lifetime, now serves the people as he always intended. The irony was not lost on observers. The state that had murdered Ivan now honored him. The system that had suppressed his innovation now celebrated it. The bureaucracy that had valued stability over progress now marketed itself as supporting technological advancement. Epilogue. The cost of progress denied. Winter comes to Kursk Oblast, as it always has, with snow and bitter cold. But in homes equipped with Sokolov systems, families stay warm while burning a fraction of the fuel their grandparents required. The technology that was suppressed for 76 years now serves exactly the purpose Ivan intended. But the years lost cannot be recovered. The millions of families who struggled through cold winters with inefficient heating while Ivan's invention sat sealed in a hidden room. The fuel wasted, the hardship endured, the potential unrealized. Historians have calculated the cost of suppressing Ivan's invention. If implemented in 1949 and gradually expanded across the Soviet Union, his heating system would have saved an estimated 400 million tons of coal and would fuel over the following decades. The environmental impact would have been significant. The human welfare improvements would have been enormous. But more than the practical calculations, there's the human cost. Ivan Sokolov was murdered for succeeding. He was punished for creativity, for innovation, for trying to help his fellow citizens. His wife lived 45 years not knowing his fate. His children grew up without a father. His invention was deliberately buried. How many other Ivans were there? How many other innovations were suppressed because they threatened established interests? How many discoveries were lost because bureaucracies feared change more than they valued progress? These questions have no easy answers, but Ivan's story serves as a reminder that innovation is not just about having good ideas. It's about operating in systems that reward rather than punish creativity, that value human welfare over bureaucratic stability, that choose progress over preservation of existing power structures. The farmer who invented free heating in 1948 vanished from history, but he did not vanish completely. His notebooks were preserved, his invention was recovered, his story was finally told. And now, 76 years late, his gift to humanity is finally being used as he intended. In a small museum in Krasnaya Polyana, visitors can see reconstructions of Ivan's workshop, examples of his heating system, and his personal notebooks, with their mixture of technical brilliance and desperate final entries. School children come to learn about innovation and injustice. Engineers come to study his designs. Families come to remember. And outside, in the cemetery where Ivan is finally buried near his wife, someone has planted a small garden. In spring, it blooms with wildflowers. In summer, vegetables grow. In autumn, the harvest is shared with village families. And in winter, when snow covers everything, a small eternal flame burns, fueled by the very heating system Ivan invented, keeping his memory warm against the cold. He was here. He created something beautiful. It was stolen. He was murdered, but his idea survived. That is enough. That has to be enough. Snow remembers what bureaucracy tried to forget, and we remember too.